Good Sunday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for July the 30th. Today we have a double chapter reading. We're going to be reading 1 Samuel chapters 21 and 22, which is going to continue the saga of David running away from Saul. We saw at the end of the last chapter in chapter 20 that Saul is just increasingly paranoid. He doesn't feel as if he can trust anyone. His own son is defending who he sees in David as being his mortal enemy. And Jonathan is very grieved by this. Him and David have concocted this plan in order to share information so that David can be kept out of harm's way as best as possible. And David knows now it's time to go on a run. So that's what he does. He takes off here at the beginning of chapter 21. And actually, there's a good map from my Bible that I'll share with you that you can see here that gives us a bit of detail about where David is running from Saul. So let's see here. We begin right up here is where we saw Samuel providing temporary shelter for David last at the end of, actually that's the end of chapter 19. Samuel and David were both together, and we had the whole prophesying event that took place. From there, we're going to see David go down here, which is where we're going to pick up in chapter 21 to this place called Nob. And this is where Ahimelech, who is the priest at the time, ends up giving David some food and supplies, this sword of Goliath. And this is where we're going to see him go from here down to from here over to Gath. And then the story is going to continue going from there. So let me go and get the text up on the screen. I will take a screenshot of this map and post it in the comments so that you guys can have that to look at and reference here in the text. All right, so let's get the text up on the screen. 1 Samuel chapter 21, and then we'll also read 1 Samuel chapter 22 together this morning. 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse number 1, David went to the priest Ahimelech at Nob. Ahimelech was afraid to meet David, so he said to him, "Why are you alone and no one is with you?" David answered the priest Ahimelech, "The king gave me a mission, but he told me, 'Don't let anyone know anything about the mission I'm sending you on or what I have ordered you to do. I have stationed my young men at a certain place. Now what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread and whatever can be found.' The priest told him, 'There is no ordinary bread on hand. However, there is consecrated bread, but the young men may eat it only if they have kept themselves from women.' David answered him, 'I swear that women are being kept from us. As always, when I go out to battle, the young men's bodies are consecrated even on an ordinary mission. So, of course, their bodies are consecrated today.' So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, for there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from the presence of Yahweh. When the bread was removed, it had been replaced with warm bread. One of Saul's servants detained before Yahweh was there that day. His name was Doeg, the Edomite, chief of Saul's shepherds. David said to Ahimelech, 'Do you have a spear or sword on hand?' 'I didn't even bring my sword or my weapon since the king's mission was urgent.' The priest replied, 'The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want to take it for yourselves, then take it, for there isn't another one here.' 'There's none like it,' David said. 'Give it to me.' David fled that day from Saul's presence and went to King Achish of Gath. But Achish's servants said to him, 'Isn't this David, the king of the land? Don't they sing about him during their dances, that Saul has killed his thousands, but David's his tens of thousands?' David took this to heart and became very afraid of King Achish of Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence. He acted like a madman around them, scribbling on the doors of the city gates and letting saliva run down his beard. 'Look, you can see this man is crazy,' Achish said to his servants. 'Why did you bring him to me? Do I have such a shortage of crazy people that you brought this one to act crazy around me? Is this one going to come to my house?' So David left Gath and took refuge in the cave of Adullam. When David's brothers and his father's family heard, they went down and joined him there. In addition, every man who was desperate, in debt, or discontented, rallied around him, and he became their leader. About 400 men were with him. From there, David went to Mizpeh of Moab, where he said to the king of Moab, "Please let my father and mother stay with you until I know what God will do for me." So he left them in the care of the king of Moab, and they stayed with him the whole time David was in the stronghold. Then the prophet Gad said to David, "Don't stay in the stronghold. Leave and return to the land of Judah." So David left and went to the forest of Hereth. Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered. At that time, Saul was in Gibeah, sitting under the tamarisk tree at the high place. His spear was in his hands, and all his servants were standing around him. Saul said to his servants, "Listen, men of Benjamin, is Jesse's son going to give all of you fields and vineyards? Do you think he'll make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? That's why all of you have conspired against me. Nobody tells me when my own son makes a covenant with Jesse's son. None of you cares about me or tells me that my son has stirred up my own servant to wait in ambush for me, as is the case today." Then Doeg the Edomite, who was in charge of Saul's servants, answered, "I saw Jesse's son come to Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, at Nob. Ahimelech inquired of Yahweh for him and gave him provisions. He also gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine." The king sent messengers to summon the priest Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, and his father's whole family, who were the priests at Nob. All of them came to the king. And then Saul said, "Listen, son of Ahitub, I'm at your service, my lord," he said. Saul asked him, "Why did you and Jesse's son conspire against me? You gave him bread and a sword and inquired of God for him, so he could rise up against me and wait in ambush, as is the case today." Ahimelech replied to the king, "Who among all your servants is as faithful as David? He is the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard, and honored in your house. Was today the first time I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Please don't let the king make an accusation against your servant or any of my father's family, for your servant didn't have any idea about all of this." So the king said, "You will die, Ahimelech, you and your father's whole family." Then the king ordered the guards standing by him, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord," because they sided with David. For they knew he was fleeing, but they didn't tell me. But the king's servants would not lift a hand to execute the priests of Yahweh. So the king said to Doeg, "Go and execute the priests." So Doeg the Edomite went and executed the priests himself. On that day, he killed 85 men who wore linen ephods. He also struck down Nob, the city of the priests, with the sword, both men and women, infants and nursing babies, oxen, donkeys, and sheep. However, one of the sons of Ahimelech, son of Ahitub, escaped. His name was Abiathar, and he fled to David. Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of Yahweh. Then David said to Abiathar, "I knew that Doeg the Edomite was there that day, and that he was sure to report to Saul. I myself am responsible for the lives of everyone in your father's family. Stay with me. Don't be afraid. For the one who wants to take my life wants to take your life. You will be safe with me." And that is 1 Samuel chapters 21 and 22. So again, David's on the run, as we see here within this text, that he, to begin with, was with Samuel in Ramah. He ends up going to Nob, where Ahimelech is, and it seems that the tabernacle is here at this time, which, again, the tabernacle was something that could be moved. It moved around depending on, I guess, the king and whoever else wanted to move it, wherever it was. This is close to Gibeah, I believe it was. So it's close to Saul's town. We're going to end up seeing here in a bit that Saul has also constructed a high place, which really, shouldn't surprise us that things were not as they should have been religiously within Israel. Whenever you have a king like Saul who does not seem to follow the instructions of Yahweh in much in any way at all, we probably shouldn't be surprised that things are as they are within the land, especially from a religious perspective. But David goes to Ahimelech, and Ahimelech is curious about this. There's probably whispers and conjecture throughout the lands that Saul and David were not on good terms. So Ahimelech asks David why he's there. David just lies. He makes up this story about being on a mission, which again shows us that there were times throughout this whole saga that David's faith didn't exactly remain as strong as it needed to be. We're going to see in a couple of chapters that Jonathan really serves as a grounding point for David, helping him to be strengthened in his faith. He doesn't have that right now, and for that we see him lying to Ahimelech here in this moment. He asks for food. All the food that is there is the holy food, and yet Ahimelech ends up giving that to David. Also gives David a sword because he has none, and he takes those things from there. An important note or an important detail is verse number 7, that Doeg, who is an Edomite, who is a descendant of Esau, is here within the tabernacle at this time. And he sees this and ends up reporting it to Saul, which is where we're going to pick up in chapter 22. But from Nob, Saul ends up making his way to Gath, which is very interesting. He would go there because who else is from Gath? Well, Goliath was. So here is the man who killed Goliath, now with Goliath's sword, coming to this place. Why would he come to this place? Maybe it's the whole idea that, the enemy and my enemy is my friends. Maybe he'd find some sort of reprieve here. And yet the people know exactly who he is. They're like, hey, this is David. Isn't he the king of the land? Which technically is not true, but it seems that people were getting the idea that this man is more renowned than even Saul is. Because after all, don't you know the song? They knew of David's reputation. Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his tens of thousands. So them knowing who he is, David becomes very afraid. And the way he combats this is by just acting like he's crazy, acting like he's insane, scribbling on the wall, letting drool fall down his beard. If we want some more insight into David's mindset here in this moment, you can read Psalms 34 and 56, both of which seem to be connected to this period in his journey. But the king of Gath, Achish, he says, listen, I've got enough crazy people as it is. I don't need another one. Just get rid of them. So David takes off very quickly from there, ends up going to the cave at Adullam, and there he meets up with his family. His brothers and his father's family all come to him, as well as some reinforcements, some men in him joining themselves to David, and he now has a fighting force of about 400 people. So from there, from the cave at Adullam, David ends up trekking all the way across to Mizpeh, Moab, which is Ker Hareseth, and he speaks with the king there and asked if his family can stay there. You might be wondering, well, that's kind of weird. Why would David go all the way to Moab to find protection for his family? Number one, his family needed protection because Saul, certainly, he's thinking that Saul will go after them. But let's remember who David's great-grandmother is. I believe that's right. Great-grandmother, grandmother, great-grandmother. It's Ruth, the Moabitess. So there was probably some sort of connection that David has with these people. That's why he feels comfortable leaving them with the king of Moab here in this moment. Well, from there, they end up making their way back to Adullam, it seems, the stronghold. And it's there that the prophet Gad comes to David and tells him that he doesn't need to stay there, but that he needs to leave and return to Judah. And David does that. Now we need to note here that this is Yahweh speaking to David through his prophets, which is something we don't see happening with Saul all that much. The connection between Saul and Yahweh just does not seem very strong at all. And I was listening to one person talk about this text, and he was making a strong case, I think, or at least a plausible case. I don't know if I'd say it's strong, but definitely a plausible case that he doesn't see Saul at all as being a worshiper of Yahweh really in any sort of fashion. That just never seems to be anything that Saul really seems to commit to. And I was thinking about that and pondering it. And again, I can see where he's coming from there, because if you think about the Israelites, they demanded a king, and they got a king not that they needed, but the king they deserved. Israel themselves was not being very faithful to Yahweh. So it makes a lot of sense that they would have a king then that was not very faithful to Yahweh in any way, shape, or form. And certainly so many of Saul's actions certainly betray the fact that he cared very little for Yahweh at all. Again, we're going to see in verse number 6 that after he finds out that David and his men have been located, that he's at Gibeah, which is he's underneath the tamarisk tree at the high place. That's a pagan type of idea, having a high place like this. His spear is in his hand because he's always looking at somebody to throw his spear at, even though he doesn't seem to be very accurate with it. But he's very paranoid here, and he really projects his lack of trustworthiness upon other people. He starts talking to those who are gathered around him. Men of Benjamin, did Jesse's son, because he won't even say David. I meant to mention that yesterday. He goes all the way back to chapter 20. He won't say David's name. He just calls him Jesse's son. Jesse's son, has he promised you just a whole bunch of good things if you'll be faithful to him? Has he promised that he'll reward you if you continue to betray me concerning him? Even my own son is making a covenant with Jesse's son. None of you are talking to me. None of you are informing me. None of you are helping me in all of this. You're just making everything harder on me today. Who's going to help me out? Or any of you on my side? Here's Doeg, the Edomite, again, one of Saul's descendants, or Esau's descendants, who is in charge of Saul's servants, his shepherds. He says, hey, I saw David with Ahimelech at Nob, and he helped him out. So if you want to try to maybe get some information, that's somebody you need to reach out to. So Saul has Ahimelech and all of his family come up to him, and he accuses him, why are you and Jesse's son conspiring against me? Again, won't say David. Why are you and Jesse's son conspiring against me? You gave him bread, you gave him a sword, you inquired of God for him. So are you doing all this so that he can rise up against me and overtake me? Is that what you're doing? Are you part of the conspiracy? And Ahimelech replies, listen, nobody's been more faithful to you than David. Again, everybody's recognizing this except Saul. He's so polluted in his thinking that he doesn't recognize the blessing that David has been to him. He says he's your son-in-law. He's the captain of your guards. He is honored in your house. What else was I supposed to do? How was I supposed to know any different? I mean, he told me he was on a mission for you. I had no reason to think anything was wrong. So please don't hold anything against me. But Saul, again, in his polluted thinking, his mind is just not where it needs to be. He orders for all of these priests to be killed. He turns to the guards standing by him, and he says, you need to kill him because they've sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, and they didn't tell me, but notice that the servants would not lift a hand to execute the priests of Yahweh. They might have done some things they should not have done for Saul in the past, but this was a line they were not willing to cross. They were not willing to go this far. But Doeg doesn't care. He's an Edomite. He's a descendant of Esau. He just kind of goes with the flow. He ends up killing not just them, but everybody within Nob, strikes everybody down, carries out harem against them, which is so interesting that Saul wants that done against this priestly city, but he wasn't willing to do that against King Agag and his people. He kept them alive, kept some of their stuff, but against his own people, they're completely destroyed. So again, just showing how backwards Saul is here during the time of his reign, and how just really evil and wicked his thinking and his mindset was. But there was one who escaped, Abiathar. He escapes. He flees to David. Somehow he's able to find David. Nobody else can find David. Saul can't find David for nothing, but Abiathar somehow finds him, and he goes and reports everything that happens. And David's really, really hurt by this. He's like, I knew that Doeg the Edomite was there that day, and that he was sure to report to Saul. It's my fault. It's my fault. He saw me with Ahimelech. He knew I was there. I wonder if David's lying. The story he made up at the beginning, I wonder if he said that in order to maybe keep Ahimelech in the dark, so that he had plausible deniability in this moment. But David still feels guilty, and he's upset by what has taken place. So he does what he can, which is to help Abiathar remain safe. The same guy that's after you is after me. We've got these 400 men. You're going to be safer in here than anywhere else. So he invites Abiathar to remain with him at this point. So there's just a lot that's going on here within this text. Continued paranoia from Saul. David, again, not exactly showing the best version of himself here. There's a lot of guilt that he has upon himself, but credit to the guards who recognize that Saul, there were some things that they just weren't willing to do for their king. And they show themselves to have better sense than the king for sure here in this moment. Just a lot going on in chapters 21 and 22, and helps to continue on this story until we finally come to resolution here towards the end of 1 Samuel concerning this great conflict and saga between Saul and David. Do you have any questions or thoughts about this chapter? If you do, please feel free to leave that in the comment section below, and we'll do what we can to think about those things or to answer any questions you might have. Really looking forward to being with everybody tonight for our Bible studies, or this morning beginning at 10 a.m. for our Bible studies and our worship assembly to follow at 11. We'll continue on in our study through Mark as we look at Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43, where Jesus shows his absolute control, his ability to overcome and to conquer afflictions, bodily afflictions, and even death. A really, really encouraging text here in Mark chapter 5. Really excited to read along through there with you to conclude this little section, which is, shows Jesus' power. First, his power over nature, then his power over the demonic, and now his power over bodily afflictions and death. Really cool study. Really excited to go through that with you here in just a little bit. Again, I appreciate you reading with me today. Hope you have a great rest of your Lord's Day. Tomorrow is the 31st. We'll have a catch-up day tomorrow, but we will be back at it again on Tuesday, reading together from 1 Samuel chapter 23. 1 Samuel chapter 23. Totally have the schedule messed up on here. I need to get that fixed. I apologize about that. I just realized the schedule on the pre-slides was totally messed up. But yeah, we'll be reading together in 1 Samuel chapter 23 on Tuesday. Hope you can tune in then. Take care and God bless.